Hello, everyone, and welcome for our next episode for this series in which we're looking in a deeper way at understanding stewardship and how it fits into our lives and our faith and our communities. Today, here with us today is Bishop Michael Boulette, one of the auxiliaries here in San Antonio, one of my mentors, a priest that really was influential in my priesthood and my formation. And so today we're talking primarily about prayer and how prayer fits in stewardship. And I think for most people, that's probably not something they think about when they hear stewardship. They automatically go to the financial, the treasure, the generosity. But I think prayer is deeply important. And how would you explain to someone why prayer fits in understanding stewardship?
Oh, absolutely. But let me just use the principal themes of our Lenten season. Whenever Lent shows around, we happen to be in it again. Yeah. But those three values that we celebrate during the Lenten season are exactly what is the connection between prayer and stewardship, and that is prayer, fasting, and then almsgiving, or the giving of alms, which is really the giving of gifts, the giving of love. And so we are, in order for us to consider stewardship, certainly in the Catholic tradition, we have to begin by asking God what God wants. Not what we want, but what does God want? What does God want from me? What's my vocation as a baptized person? What is my vocation as a member of a parish? What's my vocation as a member of the archdiocese? What is my vocation entail me because I'm baptized? And so we start with the conversation with God. No parish has built any buildings like your parish is in construction now. It doesn't begin because you wanted to build a building. At least my recollection of being a pastor for many, many years is that if we were thinking about doing something, it started by gathering people to pray about what God wanted from us, and for us to be able to see what God was asking of us. And when God gives us a vision, when the collectivity of the baptized get together and we have a vision about where we should go, then we set about the mission of trying to make it happen. So prayer is the foundation of it, is this conversation with God, which helps us understand where we're going to go. Now, we may not want to go where He's wanting us to go. And that's what the second part of this Lenten journey about stewardship is, and that is that we have to convert to His will. So if we would like to build this luxurious center for something or other, and yet God keeps telling us that the youth needs something, or our spiritual life needs something, like my center at St. Peter upon the Water, then we have to set aside the particular interests that we have and move to what God wants us to do. And so paying attention to Him. And we discern that by, of course, speaking to Him and then praying together ourselves and having conversations with God and with each other about where we should go. And when I convert to what He wants, then I have a whole different way of being. I have actually a whole different person to give, so that almsgiving is not just about opening my checkbook, but it's also about giving myself. I have a different attitude about what the parish is going to do. I have a different attitude about what the diocese needs to do, or what the church needs to do, or Catholic Charities, or whatever. I have a different attitude. I convert to, I see that the ministries of our parishes and our diocese begin with the gospel, not begin with the interest of particularly the leader, except for the leader to be faithful to the gospel. And so it's the foundational piece. And when I get through going through the process, well, then I have a more generous spirit, because it's about obedience. And it's about obeying what God wants and seeing it through the eyes of the leadership, the pastor, the archbishop, or the various heads of our various agencies, and to see what's going on. So it's a very basic, it's the foundational piece.
Yeah, and it's probably the part we struggle with most, is understanding how to hear God's voice. And you mentioned a very important word in there about discernment. That discernment is that process in which as we come closer to God, we get better at recognizing, is this God's voice? Is this my voice? Is this the enemy's voice trying to get me to go a different direction? So what kind of advice would you give someone that's trying to understand how to discern God's will versus their will in these kinds of processes?
Well, there are very real processes and rules for discernment as we experience it. And first of all, the community has to gather because it needs to pray together. It needs to have the conversation. So when it does so, it starts making lists. What are the pros about doing these things, and what seems to be the obstacles? And the obstacles don't overwhelm us. We just need to know what they are. And so we weigh them together. We seek the wisdom of the community, and we seek the wisdom of the gospel. Are we consistent with the gospel? My favorites are two things. My favorite is one thing summarized of the Ignatian rules of discernment. I boil them, take them in a pot and boil them, and just down to the essential. And so God either puts something out there in front of you, in front of the community, that's so clear, you have to do it even though you're very comfortable right where you are. Or he makes the seat you're in so hot. I mean, there's a problem. You got to deal with it, even though it's so hot, even though you don't know exactly where you're going to go, but you got to get off the seat and start going somewhere. If neither of those things are true, then you're okay right where you are. He just wants you to be where you are.
Yeah.
So when I was a pastor, in Kerrville, when I got there were many needs, people with many interests and so forth. But so what we did is gathered the community over a period of 18 months, had conversations about what they thought the most important needs were, not just material needs, but also spiritual needs, the entire pantheon of needs. And we together decided on a list of 10. And then together we prioritized them. And we said, well, what are the things that are most important? But the reality was that, there's a lot of interest groups involved in making these choices. And the wisdom of the pastor, the wisdom of the leader is that all of us work on them beginning at the first one. We don't wait to do the thing that we prefer to do, but we all work on the first list after we prioritize them, and then we start knocking them off. And then by the time I finished my first 12 years, we had completed the list, because the whole parish was working on every one, not the Guadalupanas on this thing, or the Knights of Columbus on this thing, or the men on this thing, or the youth on this thing, or the ladies on this, but rather everybody was working together because we had agreed together with God that these things, and this is these things needed doing, and this was the order we were going to do them. So that's what discernment is about. It's trying to figure out what God wants, and it's not. For those who think that that's too much trouble or is too difficult. By the way, that's sort of what Francis is saying when he's inviting us to be a synodal church, to have conversations about what it is that God wants from us. But for those who think that it's too much trouble, or that somehow it doesn't work, I just want to say this. God does not write what he wants on a rock and then throw it in the Guadalupe River and make us go find it. He wants us to know what he wants, or else he can't hold us accountable. He wants us to know what he wants, or else he can't hold us accountable. And so discernment is not an impossible thing at all. It is a work, that is, it takes energy, but so does sitting down every day to pray at a particular time. You have to show up. So we have to show up with each other to find out what it is. Then when we do it, then when everybody's involved in it, talent comes out of the woodwork, leadership and the like. Money comes out of the woodwork because people have been holding it for the thing that they thought God was asking of them. Every family has to do that same discernment. Is this where we want to put our money, and so forth? And it gets done because they've all been a part of it, and they've all been part of the vision, and now the mission is to accomplish this vision.
Yeah. And I would say Jesus says things very similar in the scriptures where you hear the quotes about, who goes to build a building without first checking to see if they're going to have the funds to build it, or to go, and he says, a king going to war doesn't first check, am I going to have enough soldiers to take care of what needs to be done? That's part of that discernment. It's a visualization of thinking ahead. Is this going to be something that God is wanting? And is he going, I guess God will always give us what we need to make sure those things happen.
Well, we can go back to the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
If the Lord does not build the house, in vain do the laborers build it. Exactly. In other words, we first have to find out whether it really is what God wants. And if it isn't, it'll fall apart. That's why it's so important that we stay attached to the church. When I felt that the mission of part of my mission as a priest was to become a spiritual director at large and have a place where that can happen, which is St. Peter upon the water, then the Lord just started knocking down obstacles, both money and people and time and so forth. And, there it is, exactly. 20 years later, prospering and growing because of God's will is being fulfilled. But that will has to be shared through prayer with the world.
Now, I guess maybe one direction we probably want to talk a little bit, when we're talking about this discernment, we're in the large group, we're talking about all the wishes and dreams of a community. How in prayer do we deal with the disappointment where maybe it's not my project that I'm wanting because that disappointment will be there. I think it's natural. How in prayer do we find peace even in that disappointment?
I don't think it's any different than a family realizing there's a limitation of resources. Mm-hmm. When the family gets together to decide if they're going to do this or vacation, or whether we're going to put this away for their children's education, or go to Catholic school and pay that tuition and so forth. It always has to deal with limitations. And so I just know this, and it's the image of the Eucharist and therefore the prayer. There is no nourishment without sacrifice. Somebody has to give up something for somebody else to have something. Mm-hmm. And so, my mom was my best example of that. She gave up all sorts of things in her life so that her kids could go to Catholic school, that they could be formed in the faith in that manner and so forth. So that's the essence of our faith. It's not about disappointment. It's recognizing that this is what God is asking us to do, and that's more important than anything that's in my list.
Yeah, and I think it's a beautiful thing to also realize in prayer that sometimes God says no.
Absolutely.
And I've always laughed with that people, they say, God didn't answer my prayer. God answers all of our prayers. It's just sometimes we don't like what he had to say.
Right.
And so it's coming to grips with that reality that God's not our fairy godmother.
True, but if we don't like exactly the way we hear it, then the reality is that we just need to pray a little more deeply, because what we recognize is that if God wants it, that should make me really happy.
Exactly.
If God wants it, that should make me really happy, and it should make me want to be on the bandwagon.
Yeah, and it reminds me of a conversation I had with a young man who was discerning the priesthood. And in his mind, he kept saying, I really want to be married, I want to have children. Will God ask me to do something that will make me unhappy? And that's why I told him, well, God's not going to ask you to do something that's going to make you unhappy.
Right.
He wants you to discern, to pray, to grow, to understand how his will fits in your life. And that how through that will, your life is going to be more abundant and more vibrant through living out that will. And so I think for us also, it's recognizing to really be willing to put ourselves in God's hands, which I think comes back all the way around for this theme of prayer. It's a trust factor. It's, am I willing to dialogue with God? Is he someone I believe is worthy of that trust, worthy of that dialogue? And if I believe God is, then the prayer comes naturally because it's someone I want to talk to. I want to be in a relationship with him. And I'm wanting to hear his voice and his guidance.
He's just an idea unless we fall in love.
Exactly.
we can't just know God intellectually. It's an emotional thing as well. That is, faith is a foundation to be in a relationship. It's the very nature of the beast, to be in a relationship. And if we are in a relationship, then everything I am came from him, and therefore everything I am belongs to him. And so when he wants me to do something, I share it. If my mother ever asked me for anything, I never said what for. It's the way I feel about the Archbishop's appeal. When I preached it in the parish, the first thing I said to the people, the first reason is simply because the Archbishop asked. Yeah. Like if my mom asked, that's enough. And that's enough. And so, we have to learn to both love and respect the God and the leaders he's chosen for us.
Exactly. Well, I want to thank everyone for tuning in on our episode today. I think Bishop Mike, your schedule is very busy, and we appreciate the time to get a chance to listen to your wisdom and this prayer, which I know is very dear to your heart. Like I said, the Spiritual Direction Center is a dream for a long time, I think, that came to a beautiful reality that assists our archdiocese now. And so I hope that as you're listening to our episode, you begin taking to prayer for this next week. Pray about how God is speaking and asking of you, and to asking you to live more vibrantly this faith that you are a part of, and how in your prayer, your stewardship and in your life, your connection to your local church, your bigger community in the world is enhanced and defined more deeply through those prayers that you do talking with our God. Thank you for tuning in today, and I hope you could turn in for our next episode.